with the panelists, them. I'm the moderator. In addition to our own questions, we welcome your questions, audience questions, which can be submitted via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Feel free to submit questions at any time during the panel. We will be keeping an eye on the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to factor in as many of your questions as possible into the discussion. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. We will post it online after it's over. And finally, if you have any technical problems with the webinar, please let us know using the chat function, which is also at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please do not use the chat function for questions. We may not see them. We will also be putting into the chat box the Twitter handles of our guests. So if you care about the issues we're discussing here today, I imagine you do, then you should definitely be following our guests. So on to the webinar. We are now 70 years since the founding of the State of Israel and the dispersal and dispossession of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. We are 50 years into the occupation and de facto annexation, and more than 25 years since the Oslo Accords. We have a critical need for thinking that moves beyond failed paradigms and thinking that challenges status quo assumptions. FMAP is holding 2 webinars right now on this topic, this one today and another one that we held last Thursday, just a few days ago, featuring Palestinian thought leaders. You can watch that one on our website. Today, we are centering Jewish-Israeli thinking and imagining about the future. And we are joined by these 4 thought leaders. Rachel Beit Ari is the director of Zochrot and a feminist political activist. She was the co-founder of PC, an independent feminist media organization, and media coordinator at Gisha, Legal Center for Freedom of Movement. As a journalist for several news organizations, Rachel covered human rights and political and social issues in China as a Beijing-based reporter. She earned an LLB from Tel Aviv University. Welcome, Rachel. Orly Noy is a journalist, translator of Farsi literature into Hebrew, and political and Mizrahi activist. She's an editor at Local Call, a member of B'Tselem's executive board, and an activist with the Balad political party. Meron Rapaport is an award-winning Israeli journalist who writes for Local Call, 972 magazine, and collaborates with Middle East Eye. He is one of the founders of the organization A Land for All, 2 States, 1 Homeland, an Israeli-Palestinian movement promoting a confederative solution between an independent Palestine and an independent Israel. And finally, Dr. Dalia Scheindlin is a leading international public opinion analyst and strategic consultant specializing in progressive causes, political and social campaigns in over 15 countries, including new and transitional democracies and peace and conflict research in Israel, with expertise in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. She works for a wide range of local and international organizations dealing with Israeli-Palestinian conflict issues, human rights, peacemaking, democracy, religious identity, and internal social issues. Dalia holds a PhD in political science from Tel Aviv University, co-hosts the Tel Aviv Review podcast, and is currently a policy fellow at the Century Foundation. Thank you all so much for being here. It's so good to have you. So I want to start. The webinar is focused on imagining the ways forward, but in order to understand why we are seeking a specific vision of the future and why that vision of the future is right, we need to understand your critique of the present. So I want to start with a round. Can you each please tell us briefly, what's the matter with now? What is your critique of the status quo? What is your diagnosis of the problem? Orly, let's start with you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you so much for having me. To answer very briefly, because to put it in a very simple manner, the terms of the so-called status quo today are that in the territorial unit between the river and the Mediterranean, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there are 2 national collectives. One enjoys sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and the other one enjoys none of those. one has the right to dictate facts on the ground as it pleases and in a very rapid way. And that's, by the way, why we are not really talking about the status quo, because the reality on the ground changes all the time to Israel's favor. And the peace that we call the status quo can be only maintained as long as the native national Palestinian collective is willing to accept Israeli supremacy, its absolute supremacy, and to be submitted to everything it wants. So if in the past Israel drew its legitimacy from security justifications, later on that became a religious justification with all the settlements in the occupied territories. Today, the only justification is an explicit Jewish supremacy. Now, this supremacy is being implemented not only by military tools in the occupied territories, but also by legal, economic, and other tools. And by the way, not only against the Palestinian population in the occupied territories, but also to a great extent against the Palestinian citizens of Israel itself. This is not an unjust and unsustainable reality, and I think that's a good enough reason to think about alternatives to it.
Thank you, Orly. Rachel, let's go to you. What's the matter with now?
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks for having me. Well, I can be as brief as one word: colonialism. The Zionist movement, Zionist settlement in Palestine took place in colonial context, and settler colonialism continues to be the framework of Israel today. It might be a unique example of settler colonialism, maybe somewhat different than others, but still colonialism with all the oppression of indigenous people that comes with it, which you see on the news every day, and I don't think needs explanation. As well as the corruption of the conscience and minds of the colonialists themselves. So everything that's happening between the river and the sea can be traced back to colonialism, and we need to talk of the struggle for justice in Palestine as a struggle to decolonize it.
Thank you, Rachel. Neron.
I think, of course, there's no, for me at least, there's no too much need to elaborate. I think when there's occupation and when 4 million people, Palestinian, are without rights, and when there is almost an institutionalized apartheid in the West Bank and maybe also in Gaza, I think this is bad enough. And it must be stopped. For me, as an Israeli Jew, it must be stopped. But I think what also is bad about the current situation is that we have no horizon. And I think we have lost, contrary to what maybe we had, occupation is not new, and maybe even colonialism is not new. But I think we had some kind of horizon, or at least an illusion of a horizon, and this is missing. And I think this is very important, and I think this is very important to bring some kind of horizon for the people to go forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Dalia. You are muted, Dalia.
I'm muted to try to save bandwidth. I think that we should all agree that no population should be living under an unelected military regime without basic human rights and national. I think.
Dalia, we can't hear you, unfortunately. Oh.
Hello?
You are back. Try that again. Try that again.
Yes, I was going to say, I don't think any population should be living under a military occupation without basic human rights and national self-determination. And I think that left, right, or center, people should agree on that. They may disagree about how we got here. But where we are now, I think that even many on the right would agree with me, it's not a good situation, it's the wrong situation. I think that the deceptive part of talking about a status quo is that there are at least 3 basic areas in which there is no status quo. On the Israeli side, Israeli presence is not static in the West Bank. It is spreading strategically in terms of location, demographically in terms of the Israeli Jewish population in the West Bank, and in terms of permanence. So not only settlers, but the infrastructure built for Israel, closed military zones, preventing Palestinian development, and that chokes off Palestinian contiguity. In terms of Palestinian, with the impact on Palestinian life, is that there is increasing social fragmentation, political atrophy and fragmentation, and as a result, a loss of democratic culture, a growing normalization of an authoritarian-like system, which, not to mention, of course, an absolute emergency situation in Gaza when it comes to basic resources, water, electricity, emergency levels of unemployment. These are situations that cannot be sustained, and they also make it much more difficult to implement any future situation. So I think that the main danger of those is in the third area, and that is beyond what Israel's doing, beyond what the impact is on Palestinians. If we ever want to get to a future resolution, which again, many people on the right, left, and center will agree that that is the preferable approach, we are changing the circumstances on the ground in permanent ways that mean that even if there are political circumstances in the future that might augur well or bode well for a resolution, the circumstances might not allow it by that time because the political culture will be so devastated and the physical infrastructure will prevent any sort of constitutional political resolution. So I think we're in grave danger right now.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So we've started. So let's talk about vision. Let's move forward. So Orly, let's start with you. You support one democratic state. Tell us about this vision. Is it from the river to the sea, one democratic state? And you specifically articulate your support for this state as a Mizrahi activist. So please speak to us about that, about the Mizrahi interest in that state.
So yes, indeed, the ultimate vision for me is a one democratic secular state from the river to the sea. And I definitely see it as a Mizrahi interest. You know, sometimes deep truths are said in a very casual manner. Some years ago, the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak defined Israel as a villa in the jungle. Now, I think that this metaphor tells the entire story, the colonial aspect of the Zionist project, of course, as Rachel mentioned, but also the attitude towards the inhabitants of this jungle, yes, the jungle being, of course, the Middle East, which the Mizrahis, the Jews who came from Arab and Muslim countries, such as myself, are part of. Now, the Mizrahis being Jewish left Israel no choice but to allow them in, very reluctantly so, by the way. But if Israel is a villa in a jungle, in the Middle Eastern jungle, then obviously its walls are meant to first separate between those who are inside the villa and those who are outside. Meaning separate between the Mizrahim and their roots, their culture, their language, their most inner identity. And in other words, to break their communal backbone. But even more than that, it is also obvious what is the status of the inhabitant of the jungle once allowed inside that villa. He will always be suspicious. He will always need to prove his gratitude for allowing him inside the villa, and he is demanded to do so by enhancing the walls of the villa in his own hands. And even if he does that, and the Mizrahi experience in Israel shows that very clearly, he might be able to integrate, to promote himself from the, let's say, from the cellar to the kitchen. not yeah, we've never had a Mizrahi prime minister. It's no accident. It's also no accident that after more than 70 years, the Mizrahis are almost at the bottom of the scale in every parameter you look at in Israel. So for me, a one state is a way to really break down the walls of this imaginary villa, which among other things will allow the Mizrahim to reconnect to the Middle East, to their cultural environment, not as second graders inside a white villa, inside a colonial villa, but as proud natives of the Middle East.
Thank you. Thank you, Orly. Rachel, your work too is focused on a vision. As the director of Zochrot, you work to raise Jewish-Israeli awareness of the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe of 1948. And Zochrot says that this work is about promoting accountability. So can you please tell us, what is your vision for Jewish Israelis being accountable for the Nakba? What does that mean?
Well, simply put, it means recognizing the Nakba, the expulsion of most Palestinians from their homeland in 1948, as a wrong, a harm done to the Palestinian people, and recognizing our responsibility, Jewish Israelis, to redress this harm as inheritors to the preparators of the Nakba, and inheritors to different degrees. And this is where the important notions that Orly made come to the conversation, inheritors to the riches amassed during and after the Nakba. Also recognizing the ongoing Nakba, that the harm, the oppression, the dispossession never stop, but they keep occurring until now, and will keep occurring until we stop them, which make us accomplices if we don't resist it. The definition then, it's simple enough, but the process isn't necessarily simple. It involves a lot of learning and unlearning what we've been taught as Israelis about the righteousness of the Zionist cause, about being the victim and Arabs being the enemy, about land with no people to people with no land, etc. Much of the work we do at Zochrot is educational work. It starts with archiving and access to knowledge, a project of mapping all 600 destroyed Palestinian localities from 1948, creating a database, naming them, describing their histories and circumstances of their destruction, and the fate of the people. This information was not easily accessible before Zochrot, certainly not in Hebrew. And accountability starts with knowing the facts of the matter, but it doesn't end there. Facing the reality of living in a racist, segregationist society brings up a lot of questions of identity, belonging, guilt, denial, finally accountability. And this conversation is best done in community. So the purpose of Zochrot is to create communities of Israelis willing to face our past and our true history and change our future. We do this work through working with teachers, creating learning materials that again make knowledge accessible, but also provide educational resources to all conversations about racism, the colonial roots of Zionism, Palestinian resistance, to call to question what we are used to calling a just war, what we are used to calling terrorism. We help create film that deal with aspects of the Nakba, whole study groups, whole tours to destroyed Palestinian localities, and this experience usually get people, especially young people, to question what they've been taught. And so to crack the taboo around the Nakba in Israeli society. So any of these actions is an act of holding oneself accountable to a certain degree. And they are meant to provide individuals with tools to keep doing this work with our own families, with our own communities, to encourage everyone around us to be accountable, as well as eventually be ready as a society to redress the but support, for me, means support Palestinian return.
Thank you. Thank you. And we're going to come back to that vision of return and what that looks like. Let's move now to Meron. So Meron, you co-founded Two States, One Homeland, a land for all. In a moment, we're going to get into the details of what the Confederation will look like, but let's start with the why. Why a Confederation? If democracy and justice for all between the river and the sea are the top priorities, why not support one democratic state like Orly instead of insisting on two states within a confederation?
Me, myself, and I think many in our group, it's not about insisting on two states. Is insisting equal rights. Now, when we're talking about equal rights, I think it is important, of course, personal rights are top priority, that everyone between the river and the sea, and also those who do not live here, like refugees, will have equal rights. This is, of course, extremely important. But we are talking about also equal national and collective rights. And when we are talking about equal national rights, I don't see any solution now, at least in the foreseeable future, that does not include the right for self-determination in a state. There are two peoples in this land, whether they came to colonialism, whether one people came through colonialism or not. This is a reality. We have 6 million Jews and 6 million Palestinians between the river and the sea today. So I think this is the main point. Now, I don't, it could be, for me personally, it could be a sort of a federation like Belgium, for example, where the Wallons and the Flemish have the have a right for self-determination. But I think still, when we are today, also from a practical point of view, meaning that I would say 95% of the Jews in Israel will not accept a binational state or one democratic state with one person, one vote. I think this, and also I think Palestinian needs an end to occupation. They need that Israeli Jews will not control their lives. So there is here an importance also for self-determination for Palestinians. So if we combine all this, I think real equality between Jews and Palestinians in this land will be through equal personal rights and equal national rights.
Thank you, Meron. Thank you. So Dalia, moving to you, tell us about your vision of a confederation, why it's the most desired future, but really, what are its main principles?
Yeah, thank you. This is the most challenging question to do in a short amount of time. But I mean, I'll just start by saying, of course, I very much agree with Meron's analysis about the values behind it. Those are the main reasons I support it. And I think that as somebody who lives here, as somebody who chose to live here, and as a political scientist, and I've had the privilege to work in many other countries, nobody gives up on their national identity. No people give up on their desire for national self-determination, which includes the need to live in communities that feel like yours, linguistically, culturally, religiously, on some level. It can be a very, civic kind of religious element. But I think that's the main reason that these need to be preserved so that each side can live in the society that they want. But how do you do that in a way that is different from what has been proposed and also one state? The basic idea is that you do have two states, but the border between them is a different kind of border. It is based on the principle of an open border, allowing freedom of movement. Open border does not mean no border. It means an end to collective restrictions of one side and individual assessment of anybody who may be a threat, but the presumption of innocence and the presumption of a right to move for all people equally, because as Meron said, it's based on equality. And that is probably the first symbol that these are two sovereign states, but that have agreed to share one of the greatest symbols of sovereign integrity, okay? is the idea of an open border and the right to freedom of movement. The other, another one of the major, I think, innovations, although it's not such an innovation in the world, but for this region, is the idea that people can live as permanent residents on the other side. So there is a right to residency or a freedom of residency. They would remain citizens only in the place of their national group or where they already have citizenship. Okay, so anybody who has citizenship in Israel now retains it. That refers primarily to Palestinian citizens, but anybody else. The point is, they can't flood the other side with their political identity because in national elections, they would vote only on their national side, but they would be allowed to live on the other side. And this allows us to break down two of some of the major sticking points of the conflict between the two sides, which is the issue of settlements and refugees. I consider it a coincidence that this is one political mechanism that can help address both sides. I am not creating a moral equivalency or political or historical equivalency between settlers and Palestinian refugees, but any sort of Palestinian return can be in that form to Israel as residents, but national rights inside Palestine, and any settlers who stay on the Palestinian side can be permanent residents voting in national elections in Israel. And Jerusalem is the last major factor, and Jerusalem remains an open, shared city, okay, not divided. And I'm happy to get into any of the details of this. I feel it's almost unfair to open all this up without explaining, but let me put this bluntly. The idea of dividing Jerusalem is madness. It's madness not only from an emotional perspective, it's madness from an economic, social, and urban perspective. And I'll be happy to elaborate, but I think that the damage that it would cause to try to divide Jerusalem with a physical international border is devastating and unnecessary and probably not even truly possible. But keeping the city open, shared, possibly the municipality run as something like a federation or a consociational system where you have all populations represented, probably in guarantees, in that municipal representation would lead to a better fulfillment of the potential for equality and a good life for everybody in the city. But in terms of the city itself, there's no need to divide it, and it serves simultaneously as a capital of the two sides. There's nothing physically impossible about putting a parliament building in Jerusalem for Palestinians, and we already have one for Israel. So that's, I know, very, very short, but I'm happy to elaborate on all of this as we go on.
Thank you, and we'll keep unfolding this. Rachel, let's go back to you. When we were in your last sentence, you spoke about your support for the return of Palestinian refugees, and Zochrot is working actively on enabling return. So tell us what this vision for return of Palestinian refugees looks like, please.
Yeah, so the vision is really for a future just and peaceful society between the river and the sea, with return being in the core of moving towards this. It means that every Palestinian who wishes to return to Palestine will be able to do so, simply put. Of course, it does not mean building a time machine to bring us back to 1947. This is what I'm always asked. Do you want to turn back time? No, it is a forward-looking vision for reconciliation based on the basic human rights, including the right to return. It entails a resettlement plan that centers the wishes of Palestinian refugee communities, comes up with detailed plan for housing, employment, etc. It can draw from previous experiences of transforming societies in other parts of the world, namely South Africa, the Balkans, other places. For example, Truth and Justice committees can be a useful tool that we can use to envision this society, maybe legal mechanisms to settle questions of land ownership, reparation, restitution. It does not mean expelling anyone from their current homes, including Jewish Israelis. It just means the end of Jewish-Israeli privilege. We, and not just we, at Zochrot and also Badil Resource Center in Bethlehem and other Palestinian organizations have done a lot of work in reimagining and envisioning and planning return. And you can check our website under Return to see some of this detailed work. I don't think I have enough time to go into details. I would just maybe mention the Council of Return, which is a group of Israelis supporting Palestinian return, which Orly is also a member of, if I remember correctly. And this work emphasizes that return actually presents an opportunity for Israelis as well to live a better life in a more just society, not as colonialists, not as occupiers, not as strangers and invaders in the Middle East, but as equals, and for many of us reconnect to our Middle Eastern roots. Israel was founded through injustice and continues to embody injustice in the way it treats Palestinians, but also Mizrahi Jews, Black Jews, women. The status of women in a military will always remain inferior to men's. So envisioning this new society that will come with Palestinian return can be liberating for all of us. So this, in just a few words, is the vision.
Thank you, Rachel. And Orly, coming back to you, in the one democratic secular state that you are envisioning, tell us about the form that Jewish identity or Jewish identities, what form does that take? And we have had already from Dalia and Meron a conversation about, or the beginning of a conversation about collective rights and self-determination and this idea that there are two peoples. You've already complicated that by complicating our vision of Jewish identity and the hierarchies among Jews in Israel. So tell us a little bit about the Jewish identity in this one state, and maybe touch upon government support for national culture. Like, what does the calendar look like? What do schools look like? Please.
Well, first, let me say that whichever shape that Judaism will take in this one joint democratic state, without a doubt, the Jewish component in the one state would be much more Jewish in the deepest sense than it is today, because it will be released from that role that was imposed upon it by Zionism to be the gatekeeper of the Jewish country. And when Judaism today serves as the gatekeeper, and because Zionism wants the gates to be very, very tight, then we are getting Judaism in Israel in its most conservative, violent, xenophobian shape. So whatever will be the shape of Judaism in the one state, it will be better than what we have today. Now, I do support one secular state, but without a doubt, as Meron and Dalia mentioned, the role of religious identities in our area is such that that state cannot and should not eliminate religion from the public sphere. But I think that the expression of that should be mostly of a communal nature. I wouldn't want to impose buses running down Mea Shearim, the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood of Mea Shearim in Jerusalem on Shabbat, on Saturday, nor in Bnei Brak. So I think that communities, religious communities, will need to maintain a certain degree of autonomy in that context, but at the same time, it's obvious that the monopoly that the Orthodox Judaism has today under the Rabbanot, the rabbinic institution, cannot be anymore. I think it will allow a much more pluralistic Judaism, that all of its different streams have equal access to the holy places, unlike today. And I think that it also gives a possibility for secular forces on both sides to promote a more liberal, open-minded agendas. I think that the state will need to support those communities to maintain their identity, their religious identity for that matter, but it will not be imposed as a compulsory component on all the citizens of the one state.
Thank you. Thanks, Orly. Dalia, coming back to you, and we are really showcasing here varieties of opinion and very differing opinion. For you, explicit ethnic separation is still preferable in your model. So what does that mean? Why is it important for Jewish Israelis? What does it mean for Palestinian citizens who maintain their Palestinian citizenship and their Palestinian citizenship in Israel when there is also a confederation with Palestine?
Okay, so I want to actually turn this question around. I actually think that the idea of a two-state confederation for Israel and Palestine is predicated on rejecting the notion of ethnic separation. It does account for the idea that each side needs national self-expression and a place that feels like the home of that national self-expression. And there is a territorial dimension to that. But the difference between this and the two-state solution in its traditional form is that we are ending the concept of a hard partition. And we are acknowledging the reality that these two populations are not only physically intertwined in both Israel and in the West Bank, and not Gaza, but Gaza is of course part of this, but they are physically interdependent. And personally, one of the reasons why I have come to become, to be a real supporter of this is that I think on a human level, we are better off when we have cultural exposure and openness, and when we're not isolated and insulated within our own communities, because guess what? Within our own communities, we find the internal divisions anyway. There is, I see the questions coming in about what does self-determination really mean and what does unified identity really mean? Guess what? Jews are not united, and there is a real question about that. So I see this as acknowledging the reality that each side has a national identity with a territorial dimension to it, but drawing on existing political and constitutional models that account for the fact that people have both material overlap, physical overlap in terms of where they live, and limited shared resources. So naming that reality, acknowledging that it's the truth, knowing how extraordinarily difficult, painful, and traumatic it will be to try to extract these populations from one another, I think the result will be devastating and unsustainable, is the way of managing the right dose of separation in terms of identity, but a reality that the two populations are interdependent on one another. And again, we can go through what that means in practice, but I think it's really about the tension between some measure of separation and embracing the reality of identity, leveraging it, building more opportunities for cooperation, which I think is more likely to happen, and that kind of cooperation is more fruitful when each side is not suffering from a fear of existential destruction of its identity. I don't think either side faces existential physical destruction, but I think that both sides do fear the destruction of their identities. And I think to use the phraseology of someone we don't like, to take those off the table by, again, giving those, that what you called ethnic separation, I'm saying is an acknowledgement of national identity, allows, I think, people to be more secure in who they are and nurtures the kind of cooperation that has to arise out of these two populations, which essentially live together with limited resources on a limited piece of land and have no choice but to get along. And I think that it also flips the lens by asserting that the future is more positive when we can cooperate in those ways. It's not that we are fated to live together and it's a shame, but let's work with it. I actually think that's something to be embraced. And I don't mean, just in a kumbaya kind of way. I think the fruits of cooperation are very empirical. Economic opportunity, cultural, synergy, well, maybe not synergy, but cultural creativity and opportunity for human development.
Thank you. Thank you, Dalia. Meron, building on what Dalia has just said, two questions for you, and I know they're hard. And And part of how I know their heart is that on your wonderful website, which I recommend everyone go to, A Land for All, you have a terrific question and answer, FAQ section. And these two questions don't have answers. Everything else has answers, but here are questions. So the right of return. Rachel is working on envisioning it, on enabling it. Palestinian refugees, explain to us, please, what is the role and the process with Palestinian refugees in your vision of Confederation? And my questions specifically are about open refugee return, or some kind of control on it, a cap. Do you support the full right of return? And also, what does reparation and restitution look like? And I'm asking specifically about your visions for equity and justice within this confederation as they have to do with return.
Right of return is a personal right that cannot be denied. We start from this. It cannot be denied. I, as a Jew, my father was born in Vilnius and came back here after 2,000 years, have no right, no moral right to tell Palestinians that they are not allowed to return. So right of return is a personal right that cannot be denied. Of course, it's a choice for every Palestinian, like many Jews decided not to come to Israel, but it's a personal choice. They don't have to come back, but they can come back. Now, the formula that we in the Land for All, and it's an Israeli-Palestinian movement. The leaders of the Palestinian movement are all refugees, considered themselves refugees. They were born after 48, but grew up in refugee camps in the West Bank and elsewhere, and in Jordan. So the idea is that everyone can return. Once he returns, he is the citizens of Palestine. Once he is the citizen of Palestine, he is also the citizen of the Confederation. He can live, reside, travel, of course, work wherever he likes, whether it's in Jaffa or in Hebron. It's up to him or he or she. So this is the basic idea. Now, as for reparation and restitution. Now, of course, even Rachel is saying we are not envisaging, planning to force Jews that are living in Jerusalem or in Jaffa or in Lid or in Ramla out of their homes. We're talking about reparation and restitution where it's possible. We didn't build so far the mechanism of this, but it's a personal thing, and personal reparation is a condition for any solution. Now, it's quite difficult. It's not easy. We are also a very young, in a way, institution, because we are the only one that are really thinking about this land as one land, the land between the river and the sea, as with two states. So there's not much research done, but I think once you treat it as personal rights that cannot be denied, then you go from there. Now, there was criticism on us and on this division that we do between residency and citizenship, that the Palestinian coming back will be residents of Israel and citizens of Palestine, as well as Jews living in Palestine will be citizens of Israel and residents of Palestine. I maybe prefer a better solution, but I think considering the situation now and considering the will of most Israeli Jews to maintain Israel in its more or less current form, I think this is the best solution. The best solution. It can be adjusted. It's open to discussion. It's not final. Nothing is final. But I think this is very important.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I want to stay with you just for one moment, because you mentioned that Israelis who live in the West Bank will maintain their citizenship inside of Israel as well. So we're talking about settlers. So, and you have settlers in your movement, and in a few moments, we're actually going to talk about the constituencies of A Land for All. But before we get there, this is a question for you, Meron, and then Dalia, I'll actually ask you to follow up on it. What about settlers in this model? And settlers live where they live? I think the early 2000s report in B'Tselem was by hook or by crook, they took their land. They received their land, they took their land by hook or by crook. Do they get to keep this land? Do they get to keep what they have taken and stay where they are in the West Bank? What is your vision for settlers?
My vision for settlers is that, first of all, if they wish to stay in Palestine, they have to give up any privileges they have. Any privileges, political privileges, the very idea, the political idea of settlement as a preferred place with privileges will not stay. It will be a decolonization of the settlement. Now, as for the land, a solution could be found, but certainly if you acquire the land by force, it doesn't mean that it will stay. What we say to settlers is that if it's so important for you to live in Judea and Samaria, and I use now the Hebrew names for these areas, if you want to live in Judea and Samaria, if it's so important for you to live in Hebron or in Nablus or of course in Jerusalem, and all these holy places for you, you are allowed to, but without any privileges. Now, the land you acquired, this is for discussion and it's easy for me when I'm talking with someone from Zochrot that also for inside Israel, the land was taken by force by Jews in 48. So there's nothing really new here. The question is, do we mend past injustices? We're doing new injustices. This we don't want. How exactly? It's open for discussion.
Thank you, Meron. Dalia, do you want to add anything about settlers, about the illegality of their?
Sure. Yeah, I think that in terms of the practical element, the main thing is that settlers, like anybody who wants to live as a permanent resident on the other side, I think the first condition is that they be law-abiding, and the law-abiding aspect relates to the sovereign law of the sovereign power. So if a settler, I wouldn't consider this a blank check for every settler and every settlement to remain, because those who are violent, disruptive, and not law-abiding under Palestinian law will lose their privileges as permanent residents to live there. I subscribe to much of what Land for All stands for. I've been a part of it since the very beginning, but I probably have some certain policy-related ideas where I differ a little bit, or maybe that I don't know if Land for All has thought about every single one of them. And I would say, depending on where the border actually goes, because we have had questions, I'm looking at the chat box about where the open, porous border goes. We envision it as close as possible to the Green Line, because it is not such a hard border, it should not be as meaningful. But for areas where there may be some settlements that the two sides decide should be annexed to Israel or attached to Israel. I don't want to say annex, because annex is unilateral. The idea is this is an agreement. If the two sides agree on that, that's okay, as long as they agree. If they agree, there are settlements that are where the location is particularly disruptive, or the population there is particularly disruptive, or that are not very permanent, caravans and hilltops, they can be dismantled. But I think the one thing I would add is that when we talk about this very sensitive issue, you know, why should they get to stay when they're there based on injustice? The reality is that settlements began within 5 weeks of the Six-Day War. We're talking about 53 years and therefore more than 2 generations. Some people have been born there and their parents born there and have grown up there. And at this point, I think Meron made a very good point. If you want to uproot those people, you're basically talking about a similar dynamic to what's happened inside Israel. It reinforces what you asked me before, whether this is a paradigm of ethnic segregation with everything that entails. If you really presume that the settlers, 100,000, 150, 170,000 of them are the key to reaching peace, I think you create a very dangerous situation where the model is based on ethnic segregation, even at the cost of uprooting people physically, where the legality, morality is questionable, considering not everybody made a conscious decision to go and steal that land. And then you create the trauma and ongoing grievances that Meron talked about, and we don't have to imagine what that's like. We have people who carry those grievances from 2005, the settlers who were dismantled, the settlements that were dismantled from Gaza. It's been disruptive, and that was 8,000 people. Now we would be talking about 100,000, 150,000 people probably, or more, under a hard partition based on ethnic segregation in a physical sense. And so I think that the far better model is to give people a choice. I'm not going to pretend this is an easy choice for either side. I've spoken with this endlessly, as has Meron, with Palestinians and with settlers. Both see it as a very problematic option. But believe me, nobody feels any better about the idea of trying to have a mass disengagement. Well, and maybe Palestinians feel better about it theoretically, but I think the results would not be nearly as I don't even see how it's possible. I think basically the result is that it will never happen. And then we will continue being in a state of ongoing conflict.
Okay. Thank you, Dalia. So what I'm hearing, and we're going to move for a moment into what it actually looks like to work with Israelis, and especially with Jewish Israelis, on all of these ideas. But also I just want to respond to you, Dalia, you and Meron, because what I hear you responding to with your plan for Confederation is Confederation versus hard partition. And part of the idea in designing this panel and having this conversation the way we're having it is that Confederation and hard partition are not the only 2 options on the table, as we know. If there even is a table. We have the ideas right now that we are opening doors and we are considering options that and thoughts and plans and visions that for a long time have not been discussed. So let's talk more about how these ideas are being developed and landing among Jewish Israelis. So Rachel, return, Nakba, education in community. Can you tell us about how Jewish Israelis receive this work, receive Zochrot's work and vision, and about inroads that you have made or not with Israelis, and how with Jewish Israelis, please?
Sure. So obviously, we're talking, I think, of the 2 most taboo subjects in Israeli society, Nakba and return, both concerning the founding myth, if you will, of Israel. So obviously, these are very hard conversations to do with Israelis, and not always well received. But yes, we have made a lot of inroads, I would say, starting with the fact that the Nakba became a familiar term to almost all Israelis, and that wasn't the case 10 or 20 years ago. So I think that's a big change. Knowing the term Nakba doesn't necessarily mean that one would recognize the Nakba as a crime against humanity, but that's an ongoing process. Gradually, I see more people in the left, the so-called Israeli peace camp, moving on from talking about just the occupation of 1967 to talking about the injustices of 48. We see a lot more commemorations of the Nakba in Israeli circles. Zochrot used to be the only one doing that. That's not the case anymore. We see it in schools, in different communities So yes, there are inroads if you are willing to breach the subject.
Thank you. Thank you. Orly, contrary, most Mizrahim do not support your vision for one democratic state. Why not? What do they support and why? Oh, I fear that Orly, oh, you're back. Orly, are you with us? Okay, while Orly, we'll come back to you. Actually, Rachel, I want to come back to you for a moment with a follow-up question. We have been talking about identity and homelands, and we have received a number of questions about Jewish identity and or national identities. And so I want to ask if the concept of a Jewish homeland is meaningful to your work. How does Jewish identity shape Jewish Israelis' approach to Palestinian refugees?
Right. So yes, the term Jewish homeland, the concept is meaningful to our work because this concept started the idea of Zionist settlement and colonization of Palestine with the false notion that this is an empty land waiting for its people, the Jews, to reoccupy it. So this is what caused the Nakba in a way, and this is what we have to dismantle. I think we need to separate really Judaism from Zionism. There have always been Jewish communities in Palestine for as long as there were Jews. And Palestine or Zion is central, of course, in Jewish faith and culture. But the idea of this historical, cultural, religious connection gives anyone exclusive sovereignty over the land or a right to oppress the indigenous people of the land or any people really. This is something that has to be delegitimized.
Thank you, Rachel. Orly, are you with us?
Yes, yes I am.
Good, good, good. Talk to us about Mizrahim and their political support. What they are not for primarily one democratic state, as you are, and as you have so clearly articulated one secular democratic state as specifically a Mizrahi political interest. So tell us about what Mizrahim do support, why they don't support your vision. What do they support?
Well, it's very true that my vision represents less than 1% of the Mizrahim in Israel. Who do they support? I think massively the right wing, but be sure that so do the Ashkenazis, because Israel generally is a very right-wing nationalistic state. So in that, but if we are talking specifically about the Mizrahim, then I think that their support of the right wing has symbolic reasons, economical, psychological, and also ideological reasons. Part of which I mentioned before, the need to be more patriotic than everybody, because otherwise you're suspected of being the wrong kind of junglist or Arab, if you will, to express your gratitude and so forth. There is also, of course, the historic hostility and the very justified hostility towards the forefathers of the today's Jewish left, and I'm talking about Mapai, which later became the Labour Party and so on. Those who observed the Mizrahim in the early 50s, very unwillingly so. If you look today at the archives of the government in the early 50s, prior to bringing the Mizrahim, you can see that they really spoke about them as savages that will need to be tamed, as dust, as human dust, and even worse than that. And then they simply exiled inside Israel the Mizrahim to the geographical, cultural, political, economical periphery. Now, and that hostility is something very difficult to find, because the Labour Party has already had 3 Mizrahi chairs, while the Likud, that is considered to be the more Mizrahi popular party, had none, never a Mizrahi chair. But still the hostility exists. Now the right wing, of course, didn't do anything to get rid of this image of the Mizrahim as barbarians, as savages, as violent, etc. But what it did very cleverly is to embrace the Mizrahim with that image, and by that actually enhancing and deepening that identification of the Mizrahim with the savage, etc. One other thing that the right wing did is to integrate the economic interest of the Mizrahim into the interests of the occupation, meaning allowing the Mizrahim to upgrade themselves economically and actually to create a new middle class Mizrahi, not such small group inside the settlements in the occupied territories, so that today the occupation actually became a Mizrahi interest. They benefited from that from a very narrow perspective. Of course, they lost in many other ways, but I won't go into that now. That's how. And one other thing is, of course, the psychological effect aspect that should not be undermined as well. I think that when you are at the bottom of the ladder, you don't want to make alliances with those underneath you. You want to upgrade yourself, and you look up, and up there you see the strong Zionist, very much Ashkenazi right wing, and you aspire to be a part of that. So these are very significant obstacles to overcome, but none of them can be underestimated.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to stay with you for a moment and ask you a follow-up question. You are a member of Balad, the political party. You stood for Knesset as part of the Balad contingent and with the joint list. Why is it important to you to advance your political agenda through Balad, through a party that represents or seeks to represent a political agenda of Palestinian citizens of Israel? And is part of your vision that more Jewish Israelis will join Balad?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that overall there is a notion that Israel's problem with the democratic concept began with the occupation of '67. That until then it was perfectly Jewish and perfectly democratic, but the basis of Jewish supremacy was inherent to the state of Israel from its very beginning. I mean, we should remember that throughout most of the years since the establishment of the state and until the occupation, I mean, before the occupation even occurred, the Palestinian citizens of Israel were under military rule, yeah, and the demographic war against the Palestinians didn't start with the occupation of '67. It started with the unrecognized villages, the confiscation of lands, a list of discriminatory laws, etc. So I think that the 48 Israel, or Israel within the borders of 1948, is an illusion of a Jewish and democratic, and that the true problem with the understanding of the concept of democracy begins there, and that's why that's the place to start the correction from, by turning Israel within the 48 borders to a state for all its citizens, and that's the main agenda of Balad. And I think that even here there is a Mizrahi angle for me, that, you know, belonging to a marginalized community, I think that we know that marginalized and discriminated against communities need true democracy more than anybody else. So I think that to inactivate our democratic muscles begin in 48 territories, not in 67. And I think that this is the place to separate after 72 painful years from the illusion of the Jewish and democratic. And this is, and to move forward to something civil, to a truly democratic civil concept. And this is exactly what Balad is suggesting. And that's why I'm there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Meron, we're going to stick with this theme of what it actually looks like to generate support, to build support for your ideas. One of the things that we hear is that there is very little support between the river and the sea for equality between the river and the sea and for Confederation. So that's obviously not true. I want you to tell us, please, about your project of building support for Confederation. Who are your supporters? Who are the constituencies that you serve, that you bring in? What brings them to support the ideas of Confederation, please?
Well, of course, the constituencies are theoretically everyone. It's not that we are going to make a confederation only with leftist Jews or secular Palestinians. So everybody should be in. Now it's a long process. I think the support, the last poll that was done by Dalia, I think said something like more than 30% of Israeli Jews supporting this, more or less the same in Palestine. So it's not tribal. And considering that we are a very small organization with very limited resources, so we never did a campaign or anything like that. It's only just, putting forward our ideas. But I think there is, and I'm maybe a die-hard optimist, but I think there is a change also in Israel. And maybe it's from the nation state law I see this change, that people also in the center and center left, and maybe even more to the right, understand that the situation of Jewish supremacy is not a sustainable one. It's not a sustainable one. I think people do understand it. And we've seen it with the rise of the Joint List and the more support they gain also from Jewish voters, but not only voters, the fact that they are considered more part of the political game. We see a change there. Now, what we see is the abolishing of Jewish supremacy over the whole of the land between the river and the sea. This is the idea. So I think people do understand it. Now, we are talking to settlers. I cannot tell you that we have huge support among settlers, but I think they understand our point. And in the center left, the old center left, I see a real change. And Palestinians inside Israel, I see a change. Palestinians in the West Bank, I see a change. But I will tell you one thing. We are talking about right of return before. I set to this project because of right of return. This is what made me go into this project. I really thought that the first moment I will go into a Jewish house and talk about right of return, I'll be kicked out, maybe politely. It didn't happen. It didn't happen, although in every meeting, and I personally had more than 700 meetings with thousands of people. I was never kicked out, although I always insisted on right of return. Because if you put right of return in a general framework of mutual recognition, we we Jews and Palestinians are part of this land, then I think people see even the very difficult and taboo issue of right of return in a different light. So I'm optimistic, and I hope I have something to found my optimism on. But this is how I see it.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to ask you a follow-up question. You have Palestinian partners, and you just spoke for a moment about seeing change among Palestinian citizens in Israel and also Palestinians outside of 48 Israel. So I want to ask you, what about the support for Confederation and your Palestinian partners, both Palestinians who are citizens of Israel and Palestinians who are either living under occupation now or living in exile?
I want to be frank. Palestinian in the West Bank, in Gaza, of course, it's very difficult, of course, to have any connection. And also, Palestinian diaspora, it's also a little bit difficult. But I'm talking about Palestinian in the West Bank. I think for Palestinian in the West Bank, the old two-state solution was generally accepted, although not with great enthusiasm, but was generally accepted. And what we offer is much better because it offers also freedom of movement, right of return. So there's no real opposition. Maybe people say Israel doesn't want peace, Jews do not want peace. This is something that we encounter a lot, but the basic idea is accepted. As for Palestinians inside Israel, I think the issue of two states, they still stick, most of them, to the idea of two states. They don't like the idea of settlers remaining, although we explain that we are changing the status but settlers are, and justly so, are considered as the as the villains in the conflict, and I can understand exactly why. So it's very difficult for them to say anything that will in any way allow for settlers to remain. But I think we're going forward also there.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for this conversation. I wish that we had much more time. We received questions. I wove many of the questions into our questions, and there were other questions that we were not able to get to. And so please, for our viewers, rest assured that we are sharing all of your questions with the panelists so they will know what you are interested in, what you wanted to hear more about. And so will we at FMEP, and we take this very seriously, so thank you. And I want us to finish with one last round, one last question, which is to each of you. You are speaking to an international audience. Close us out with what is one thing that you want us to take away from this webinar, or one thing that you want to ask of this international audience? One thing that you want to ask of us. Rachel, let's start with you.
I would want to ask anyone to educate yourself about the Nakba, what it is, what it means. And I think as an Israeli citizen, I can't say support the BDS movement, so you know.
Thank you, Rachel. And Orly.
One thing I would want you to remember is that it's not just an academic, intellectual exercise for you, but that the international community is heavily involved in the occupation and allowing it and funding it. So following that, my request is seek accountability from your own governments. I mean, your governments, look where your money and your political resources go to. And
Great, thank you very much. And Meron.
I would say that the evident failure of the classical two-state solution does not mean that everything is lost, does not mean that necessarily we are going for the end of the state of Israel. There are other possibilities, and for Jewish homeland within Confederation, Federation, whatever.
Thank you so much, Meron. And Dalia, please.
wish I could do this in one really short sentence, but I just think that for international audiences who care, we should keep in mind that we need both a value system in place and immediate steps to reach any form of political resolution, whether you believe in 2 states, 1 state, or a hybrid solution. This situation is immediate. The solution is not, but the urgency is there, and there are things that can be changed starting now that will help us facilitate reaching and implementing any other solution. I can't go through them all, but they certainly involve Israel changing its political status in the West Bank and expanding settlements. They certainly involve political and economic development for Palestinians, not in place of political resolution, and for God's sakes, releasing Gaza from prison and fostering greater Palestinian mobility and integration that will make everybody's lives better and more amenable when there is a future solution. Please don't give up on the immediate steps if there's any way for internationals to get involved, or at least to understand the conflict that way.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for everything you shared. Thank you to everyone, to all of our attendees for tuning in. I wish that this conversation could have gone on much longer, and we will continue to dig into all of these issues through our future webinars and programming. Come to the FMEP website, please, fmep.org. Come see our original research, and especially come and see a recording of this webinar, which will be available later today. See further resources on this topic, and come back for future webinars. Thank you all very much.